So we've received all of our bearings from BMW, and we're just setting up the crank. I've got the crankcase all cleaned up, and I'm going to lay my crank in there. So I'm just following the map that I laid out with my bearing code deciphering and starting to install the bearings into the upper part of my case. And I need my back one. I'm just cleaning the old sealant off of the main crankshaft bearing saddle. Big splooey hole up in there. Can you grab me another can of this, please?
Yep.
I think that is definitely the way. I mean, there's a little starting thing where it gets started, but that just could be hydraulic, but once it's going. And this could also be until we're on and bolted down. So we've got all of our bearings into our engine carrier right now. Everything is cleaned off and dry, ready to install. We have a separate video on how to identify which bearings are which. What BMW does is they use a combination of codes. One is on the crankcase and one is on the crank to determine the different bearings and where they go in that location. So check that video out. You'll need to know that before you order bearings, but in the meantime, we're going to go slide this onto this engine. So the torque schedule on these is a 20 Newton meter start, then a 70 degree torque angle. And we're just working from the center out in a crisscross pattern. much better. Yeah. So until you get it down there, like right now it's rotating very, very smoothly. When we first had it laying there, it was kind of a little tighter than I really wanted to see, and now I can actually go in reverse. But with that 20 Newton meter torque, it's seated all of the bearings, and the crank is rotating very smoothly, which is what you want to see. So we've got our first one at 70 degrees. Crank still feels nice and smooth. We're done this one?
I have to review the footage.
Oh, you're filming?
Yeah.
Oh no, pretty immediately because it'll feel too tight.
I think you have.
Nope.
Okay, you have.
Need to use a smaller socket on that one. Okay, so with everything on and tight, you can see I'm just turning it over with one finger. It should be nice and smooth. Should be able to go both directions without any problems whatsoever. The only thing we've got to check is going to be our backlash, and we'll do that in just a little bit. So looks like our backlash is right at 0.1 of a millimeter. I'll need to check the spec book, but it looks like it's a pretty standard backlash for most engines. Most engines you're looking between 0.1 and 0.15, but it feels good back and forth. So I'm tightening down my crankshaft bed plate. These are our aluminum screws down in here. These are all replaced. They're a one-time use. I've gone around and I've torqued the entire perimeter to 15 Newton meters for the 10 millimeter aluminum screws. Now what I have to do is tighten them a further 90 degrees. So I have my snap-on torque angle, and I put that onto my bed plate with my socket. Zero the degrees, and then I want to tighten this to 90 degrees. I'm going to bring it around like that. Then the last thing I do is I take my Sharpie and I just put a black line on the bolt to know that I have tightened it. And I'm just going to continue around and do all of the bolts. So on the 8 millimeter bolts, which are there's 2 of them in the front and 2 of them in the back, the starting torque is different. There's still a 90 degree torque angle, but instead of starting at 15 Newton meters, they're going to start at 8 Newton meters. So I'm just going to bring these down to 8. And I'm using this meter because it's a very low torque, and a click style torque wrench can have some issues dealing with something at this lower value. Okay, so now we've got to do the same 90 degree torque angle. So I've put in the new injection nozzles. These have to be replaced every time, and this is like a little check valve right here. This is the BMW flange sealant. I have both the intake and, both the front seal and the back seal out of the crankshaft right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to inject it. There's a passageway that runs along the bed plate that comes all the way around to both the front seal and the rear seal. So we're going to inject into here until we get sealant coming out of there to know that we've got sealant throughout the entire bed plate. Then we'll have to do the same on the other side of the engine.
Does it have like a needle?
Well, it does, but the needles, I think the best thing for this is just press up hard against it and start screwing it in. I don't know if you can look at the front and tell me if you get any.
I will, but I don't know where. Oh, I see it. It's coming out.
Okay, check the back side.
Okay. I see it at the back side.
Great, then we're done.
It's like honey.
Yeah.
Okay, I see it here. Okay, you're going to do the other side?
Yeah.
Here it is.
Okay, come check the back.
Yep, it's out the back.
Great, because I think that was about it for the bottle.
Yeah, well, it's a good push out the back.
There we go. Alright, so we've finished prepping our pistons. I have new set of piston rings. BMW is about the only game in town that I could find that I trusted. Expensive, about $600 for a set of rings. And I also have my connecting rods, bearings for my connecting rods. And what I've done here is, this is off of the crankshaft. This is the rod specifications that tells you what rod combination to use on each bearing placement. So for example, cylinder 1 is a B, and that's a purple and blue bearing. Now you can also check that with plastic gauge. I did it with a micrometer and measurements to show me my clearance. My bearing clearance was right around 0.03. So everything was looking pretty nice. Then what I'm going to do now is assemble my rings onto my pistons, assemble my pistons onto the rods, and install them into the engine. So one thing that I did quickly is I just put the top ring into a cylinder and wanted to see what my piston end gaps were, because we did hone these. I did measure my clearance between piston and bore. My running clearance on the pistons with a honed bore was 0.06 of a millimeter, so well within the operating range. But I wanted to see what my ring gap was, and I measured this with a feeler gauge. It came in at about 0.25, which is right in about the normal range. Normally I'm looking at for a ring gap between 0.15 and 0.3 of a millimeter. So I've also put cylinder number 1 in, and I just wanted to see how everything felt. Everything is certainly very nice and smooth. Piston went in very nicely. Everything rotates very smoothly with no issues, so I don't foresee any issues going forward getting the rest of the pistons installed. So when you're assembling the rings onto the piston, the first one I start with is the oil ring, and this is a 3-piece oil ring. You take the spreader spring and you'll see it's painted yellow on the ends. This is so you know that it's butting up together. That's how it should look. What you don't want it to do is overlap. So when it's installed, you want to see that butt like that. Then I'm just going to put it on to start and wind it in very carefully, and make sure you can see right there those butts are lined up, and I'm also right above my wrist pin. Then we're going to take the uppers and lowers, doesn't matter whether it goes on the bottom or the top first. I'm just going to rotate the piston because I want these on the edge of my thrust face, and I'll usually just start it and carefully wind it on. Once I've got my first one on, I'm going to turn the piston, make sure my yellow still hasn't overlapped, turn it back, and on this one we started that ring gap right here, so I want my second ring gap to start on the other side of the wrist pin. and that should sit just like that. So when we go to install this, we're going to make sure that our ring gaps are in these positions. Next one is going to be the second ring, and the second ring is black. It has a GOE5 etched right here. Now it doesn't actually say top on it, but if we look at the ring design, we can see it's a stepped ring. This step usually will want to face down, and so the writing will tend to want to face up. So I'm going to install the second ring. I'm going to just gently expand that. Slide it over, and I want to be able to make sure it rotates freely in the ring groove. This one I want to clock 180 degrees from my oil scraper gap, so it's lining up with my yellow paint. And then the last ring is my top compression ring. This one is marked. It's very hard to see, but it is marked top. It is also GOE specifications. And this one, when we look at it, is basically a square ring. So we're just going to go and drop this on. It is also a different thickness from the second ring, so you can't mix them up. The second ring will not fit in the top ring spacer. You could theoretically put the top ring in the second ring, but you'd figure it out pretty quick when you went to put the last ring on. And then I'm just going to clock it so the gap is over by my pin. So there's my piston rings on. Next is to put it on the rod. So I've got my rod prepped right here. First thing I'm going to do is take my old rod bolts out. And we're going to put those over there because we cannot reuse them. They're a one-time use. I have my wrist pin and my upper lower rod caps. The other thing you want to make sure is when you take a look at these, there will be, and they are very hard to see, you can see that it's etched onto the rod, and matching this is YI, I think, and YI. So you want to make sure that these two match. These are a brake style connecting rod. That means they are not machined in on these surfaces, and that brake is extremely unique. It means that the rod is literally one piece once it goes back together. Now I'm just going to lubricate my wrist pin. Start that into my piston. Make sure it should move freely but shouldn't have any play. Lubricate my rod. Slide everything all the way through. I've already got my wrist pin on one side. I only took out one side to disassemble. And then on the other side, I need to assemble my circlip into it. So I'm actually using one of my crossover Porsche tools since they're a 22mm circlip. And this is just a circlip injector, which makes it a lot easier to put in. So I want to line the circlip up at the top. That's injected in. You can see the circlip is all the way home, and the piston moves back and forth and rotates freely on the rod. So we're ready to install this one. Ready to install this into the engine, so I need to put on my bearings and the rest of the connecting rods. We've got the first one in, which was a code B. The rest are all code R's. So that's a yellow and red combination, which makes it easy on me. I have this one, is the last three. 714 is going to be my yellow, and 034 is going to be my red. Now these will only fit in one place on the connecting rod, so you don't have to worry about screwing up that. And if you do open them up, all of a sudden look at them and then realize, oh crap, I forgot to look at the number, they do have their color code on the side of the bearing as well. So we're just going to open these up. So we can see on our bearings, and there is a noticeable difference on the thickness that you can feel. Red is considerably thicker than the yellow. And when I look at it on my connecting rod, the yellow one with the tang will fit into the connecting rod. If I try to put the red bearing in, it physically won't fit because where they've ground the little relief for the bearing tang won't line up. So we're going to put in our yellow. We want to just lock it down and seat it, make sure it's all the way down. And then on our red, we're going to slide that in like that. Make sure it's all the way seated. Alright, so I'm going to assemble this one into cylinder number 2. If I look down the top, I've got the crank wound all the way down to the bottom, so it's out of the way. We want to be careful of the oil squirter jet when we go in. I'm going to take my oil can and I'm just going to run some oil in the cylinder bore. These have already been cleaned and wiped down. Then I'm going to take some oil and I want to oil in on my ring grooves. And then I'll grab my rings and I want to rotate them to get that oil everywhere in through there. Next, I want to look at my orientation. So I've got my second ring orientated towards the pin, top ring orientated towards the opposite side of the pin. Also want to make sure I get some oil on our thrust surfaces. Like that. Lastly, we want to orientate our arrow. Now, because I painted the tops of these and BMW laser etches their direction arrow, I just lightly engraved it so I could see it through the dome pane. We want to orientate that towards the front of the engine. I want to line my connecting rod up so it's straight across, and I'm just going to start by very carefully lining that into the piston, into the bore. Just let it sit on the rings like that. Okay, so I'm using my favorite ring compressor for this style of job. This one's about 30 years old and it's probably the cheapest one I've ever bought, and it seems to work the best. Okay, so I just want to square that up. Make sure my ring compressor is sitting hard up against the bore, and then I'm going to use the wooden part of the handle, and you want to go very gently here because you want to feel the rings as they go in. So not a lot of force required. And then to make sure that everything is still good, you just want to put your thumbs on either side right here, and that piston should move down relatively easily. If there's an excessive amount of drag, then you've most likely caught a ring and you want to stop, pull the piston out and start again. Okay, so I can see that my connecting rod is all the way down. Just put a little bit of oil there. I want to put some oil on my bearing, and then I want to line these tangs up with the tang down here on that bearing. So I've lubricated my connecting rod bolts on the threads. These should screw in finger tight at first. Alright, so the bolts on these are the same as pretty much every other bolt on a BMW in that it uses a torque angle. So the starting torque is 20 Newton meters, so I've got my torque wrench set to 20 Newton meters. And I'm just going to set that starting torque on each one. Then I want to grab the rod, and it should move nice and freely side to side. If it binds up, then you've got a problem with your bearing clearances. And then lastly, I can check by rotating the crank. Now I'm going to do the torque angle on all of these once I have all of my pistons and connecting rods installed into the engine. Alright, so I've already got all of our connecting rods in. They've all had their initial torque to 20 Newton meters. These are now torqued to a 70-degree angle. So I'm locked on. And right there at 70. Then after each one, you just want to make sure everything rotates nicely. Just so I know I've done it. So I'm going to go through and tighten all the rest down and then move on.